Welcome to the Principal's Perspective. I'm Dr. Adrian Camm.
And I'm Teagan Collins. Let's get into today's episode.
Hi, Teagan.
Hi, Adrian.
Back for another episode.
Looking forward to our conversation today.
Today, we're going to be talking about responding to a critical cybersecurity incident. And I think it's useful to frame this episode for our listeners in the context of our digital strategy.
We launched our digital strategy 4 or 5 years ago now, and that was the first time the school had a digital strategy of that kind. And we really positioned cybersecurity within the digital strategy as a key deliverable.
Absolutely, because we wanted to be at the forefront of digital, and that was the goal and the key objective that we set out to do. We wanted to be leading in this sector, and I think we've done some amazing work over that period of time. But it's no point leading in digital if you don't have robust, safe and secure IT systems, and hence the focus on cybersecurity. So I think in a previous episode, Teagan, we talked at length about our digital strategy, how it was developed, how it was presented to our community, how it was communicated, how it was project managed, how it was reported against, and then how it was evaluated before we launched into the second iteration of that strategy. So we're not going to cover that ground again, but I thought today it would be a really good opportunity for us to talk specifics. So if we're going to be talking specifics about cybersecurity, we need to understand the landscape in which we're operating. And right now, cybersecurity is considered one of the biggest risks, not just for schools, but for organisations in this country, if not around the world. All executive teams, all CEOs, all principals, all boards, if they're not talking about it, they should be.
Sounds great. So why don't we start by talking about some of the common cybersecurity risks, particularly in our sector, that schools are seeing?
You've got your standard cybersecurity risks like phishing, hackers.
Not phishing in every sense of the word.
No, we're not going phishing.
PH phishing.
PH phishing. Phishing in terms of threat actors or malicious people or hackers trying to elicit information for use in malicious ways. You've got things like email spoofing, which is really common in schools, where someone pretends to be someone else. Their email almost looks identical and they're asking someone to give them something. Typically it might be, can you go and get me a gift card? Can you transfer $10,000 into my account? But it's not the real person. It's someone pretending to be someone else. And that's connected to social engineering, which is another threat, another risk in cybersecurity in schools, which is very much this idea of someone with malicious intent trying to understand your social construct within your organisation in order to get access or information. And with AI advancing at exponential rates, we're seeing more and more AI automation and voice clone attacks of that nature. So there are a lot of common cybersecurity risks that we could talk about here, but we're not going to go through them all. But I think the important thing for our listeners is the fact that right now, as of 2025, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, otherwise known as the ACSC, is reporting a critical cybersecurity incident every 6 minutes. And that's just the ones that are being reported. So it's a huge area. It's an area of risk for all schools. It's not a matter of if something will happen. It's a matter of when. And so we need to be considering questions like, what is our cybersecurity posture as a school? What is our stance? What is our cybersecurity maturity levels as an organisation? And what would you do if there was a critical cybersecurity incident at your school tomorrow? Do you have the required protocols, policies, processes, procedures in place? Do you know what your insurance covers? Does your insurance cover cybersecurity incidents? And what recovery mechanisms and emergency response protocols have you built in to your day-to-day practice? These are all essential questions for principals, for executive teams and for boards to be considering, Teagan, for their business continuity, but also for their reputational risk management, because as we know, the media loves reporting on cybersecurity incidents, and we've seen some really high profile things in the media of late.
And we need to be aware that as schools, we hold critical data of thousands of people, alumni, current parents, current students, addresses, bank details, personal information, the list goes on. So having an understanding of where our information is stored, is it on site, is it in the cloud? How often do we need to make sure that that's backed up? What security practices are we running on the ground with things like multi-factor authentication? And how often are we having this conversation with our staff? What type of training processes do we have in place from a professional learning perspective so that, as you say, when staff do get that email, How are they going to respond? Not opening links sounds small, but in large organisations, large schools with hundreds of staff and thousands of students, the risk is high.
The risk is really high. And oftentimes we're seeing people who are falling victim to these sorts of attacks are the ones that don't have the correct processes in place. Because if you have the correct processes and procedures in place, that mitigates any of these potential cyber attacks. So, for instance, if I'm authorising a payment here at the school, there are a series of steps in place to make sure that we're following not just our delegations, but also our security processes as well, to make sure that things are getting paid by the right person to the right people and it's all been authorised correctly, rather than just our director of business getting an email from someone pretending to be me saying, hey, can you transfer 50 grand into my bank account tomorrow? Well, no, you can't, because there'd be procedures in place to prevent that. But I think one of the big things, Teagan, for me in this landscape in cybersecurity when we're talking about schools is this idea of a ransomware attack.
Well, why don't we talk a little bit more about that, the ins and outs of what that actually looks like?
Very simply, a ransomware attack is when threat actors or hackers gain access to your network and they deploy a piece of software which then goes and encrypts your network and your data so that you can't access it. No one can access it. No one can log in. You don't have access to your own system anymore. It essentially locks your network. And that's a really scary thing for schools and businesses to contemplate in terms of their business continuity, because we are so reliant on our databases, on our IT networks, on our means of communication, that if something like this happens, it can stop businesses in their tracks. So typically what happens then is, let's say a threat actor has gained access to your network, deployed a piece of software, it encrypts your entire network and locks everyone out. Then what happens is they would make contact with senior leaders at the organisation to say, we've deployed this ransomware attack, we've locked your network. If you want access to the keys that would decrypt things and unlock everything again, it's going to cost you some money. Now, typically, that can be in the millions of dollars. So you've got threat actors, you've got organised crime networks in this space from all around the world actually demanding huge ransoms. And they've done their homework. So it depends upon what's the annual turnover of the business that they're attacking, and they're making really sophisticated demands. Now, threat actors can then decide to do one of two things. And before we get into what I think are the correct steps to follow if something like this was to happen in your organisation, one, there's no guarantee that if you pay the money, they'll actually give you the keys. So that's something to really consider. The other thing too is if you have the appropriate backups in place and you decide not to pay the ransom, and then you just back up and restore your system and your data from a previously saved state, you then run into the reputational risk of, if the threat actors have access to your data and they've exfiltrated that, which means they've gained access to that outside of your system, what's stopping them from leaking it onto the darknet? So then that becomes a reputational and a privacy and a confidentiality issue for all your stakeholders.
This just highlights how incumbent it is on us as school leaders to have business continuity plans, so that if we walk into school one day and we go to log on and start up for the day and we see that we can't gain access to any networks, or we have received notification from a threat actor pertaining to ransomware, that we know what we're going to do. And I know we're going to get stuck into that shortly, but I just want to revisit what that actually looks like. So ransomware attacks happened, thinking about the school systems and structures that we don't have access to. So for our school setting, that would mean particularly synergetic, school box, centralised Wi-Fi network, all of our data. What else entails within that group?
It depends on the extent of the attack, but typically it would relate to everything that was on premise. So any databases, any servers, any of your IT systems, platforms that you hosted yourselves, that would absolutely be not accessible under a ransomware attack. It could extend to cloud-based services. That's a more sophisticated ransomware attack, perhaps, but it has been known to happen. So I think you may be lucky in a school environment if, let's say, you use Outlook 365, which is cloud-based, that you may still have access to your organisation's email system, for instance. But that might be it.
So you can't mark roles.
Right.
There's no learning management system.
Right.
You can't send messages through global SMS. You can't contact parents. You don't have parent phone numbers. You don't have student timetables or staff timetables.
You're locked down. And so real big issue. And I've known of many schools across the country that have suffered from one of these attacks of late. And so it's becoming more prevalent, particularly in the independent sector. But as I said, it's happening to businesses and companies and organisations all around the country, all around the world, every single day.
So let's talk about how long you could be offline for.
I think it depends. My thinking goes to, well, what would you do if something like this was to happen in your school? And for me, the steps in that process would be you identify that something's happened, you've been locked out of key systems, you've perhaps been contacted by a threat actor to say that you're currently subject to a ransomware attack. So for schools who are operating in a mature space in response to these sorts of incidents, they would immediately launch their cybersecurity breach protocol, which should be part of their business continuity plan. And then they'd immediately contact their insurer. So all schools have insurance. Whether their insurance covers cyber critical incidents is another question, but you'd be immediately contacting your insurer. You'd also then contact your cybersecurity provider, assuming you have one. Now, if you don't, that's a different pathway that you would take. But if you have a cybersecurity provider, you would contact them and they would probably quite quickly launch their rapid response action team, who would start doing a threat analysis to determine the level of compromise on the network. And if your insurance does cover cybersecurity incidents, and in the eventuation of a really serious ransomware attack, the insurer would likely then also engage a cybersecurity specialist law firm, who would then also engage a team to do some further forensic analysis to try and determine what's happened, and then a specialist company to potentially manage any negotiations with the threat actors who are demanding ransom. So there's quite a few players involved if something like this was to happen in your school.
There's lots of different levels, and particularly if you're not engaging in this space, if you're operating from an immature level, then there's layers and levels of people that you've never interacted with before. And there's a naivety perhaps in the understanding of your networks. But there's also legal implications for you as a principal and legal implications particularly for directors, which I find fascinating. When we dug into this and started beginning our work in this space, that was a blind spot for me many years ago. And understanding those ethical intricacies and layers of when you're a principal and this happens, the personal implications that this may hold as a result for you and for your fellow directors, if you're an executive director on the board or depending on your position. I'm interested to delve into that now.
It's really interesting. If you look at Australia as a country, it's not illegal to pay a ransom for a situation like this, but it is strongly discouraged. So it's not law, it's not policy, but if you look at all the national organisations and groups that work in this cybersecurity area, they would strongly discourage any organisation from paying a ransom for a number of reasons. But really, in the independent system, it's left to principals and boards to discuss and decide upon the board's risk appetite and a cyber security governance policy position in terms of, if this happened to you and your school, would you be willing to pay ransom and under what conditions? So that's really interesting for me to consider. But one of the things that comes out of these situations, Teagan, which people might not know about, is that there is a risk that is real and substantial in terms of what they call sanctions and criminal law. And basically what that means is that if you are in a situation where you decide to pay a ransom, and that's a viable and necessary part of your incident response, then there are some things that you have to consider that you would not have considered before. Because schools could be potentially breaking the law if they pay a ransom to a threat actor or a threat actor group that is on the international sanctions list or is part of a known terrorist organisation. And that's really hard for you to determine if the threat actor is anonymous or they're not claiming that their attack is through a particular group. So that's why the layers that we talked about before in terms of specialised law firms and forensic analysis and specialised negotiation parties are all really essential, because whilst this is happening, they'll be actually doing their due diligence to try and find out as much as possible about the particular threat actor that's accessing your network in this particular instance. The complicating factor for this is that we're a school in Australia, and so typically we'd be governed by Australian law. But in a situation like this, it extends beyond Australia. And so of concern is if you've got directors on your board, or even if the principal or CEO is from a different country or holds dual citizenship, we have to consider their country's law around this particular scenario as well. So let's say a ransomware attack's happened. You've gone through the steps that we've talked about already. And then you convene your school critical incident response team. You'd be starting to think about what you're communicating to your community throughout this time, because it's really important for us to consider what we're communicating. But really, you've got two decisions to make. Are you going to pay the ransom, or are you not going to pay the ransom? And sometimes you don't have a choice.
Tell me more about that.
Well, let's say that your school is following industry best practice backups and recovery mechanisms for your IT. That means that you've got triple redundancy backups built in. You've got one backup that's air-gapped and it's off-site in a secure location. And these are happening frequently, daily perhaps. You're in a really strong position to make a decision to not pay the ransom. Because what you could do is you could completely restore your entire systems and data from one of those backups and ensure business continuity, and it might take only a couple of days. The risk with that is that the threat actors then leak your data onto the darknet, and it becomes a data issue rather than a business continuity issue. Let's say, on the flip side to that though, that you find out that your IT team is not following industry best practice in terms of data recovery and backup mechanisms. They don't have the correct procedures, policies, and systems and structures in place. And let's say that your data hasn't been backed up for 6 months. Well, can you restore your systems based on 6-month-old data?
So you've lost assessment, reporting, new students, current student enrolments.
Right. Financial information. Maybe you could. And so then you might be in a situation where you feel as though you don't have any choice other than to pay the ransom.
What percentage of schools do you think have, as you would describe, mature cybersecurity posture?
Very few, because it's expensive. It's resource intensive, time intensive. And let's face it, schools are complex places and we've got other things that we need to focus on. And 10 or 15 years ago, we didn't have to worry about this. This is a relatively new thing for schools to be concerned about. And schools aren't resourced or equipped necessarily with the people who know what they're talking about. So are they resourced financially to be able to bring in the external expertise that they require? That's another thing. For some schools, it's not even on their agenda or their radar. And that's scary. But in saying that, it will increasingly be on every school's radar, because it's not a matter of if, but when. And it's one of the biggest risks, I think, right now in schools outside of child safety and those sorts of things that we often talk about.
So we've paid the ransom.
Yep.
Or we've backed up.
Right.
What else do we need to think about?
You've got a lot of compliance obligations that you need to consider once you understand that there's been a network compromise, particularly in terms of ransomware, and if your data's been accessed. Typically, you'd need to log an incident via ACSC, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. Then you have to, potentially it's a notifiable data breach, so you have to log that report as well. Then you have to start thinking about the communications. If it is a data breach, what are you saying, who are you saying it to, and for what purpose? Typically, you'd be engaging legal expertise throughout this. They'd be assisting with the communications. Sometimes you won't be able to say too much because the investigation will be ongoing. So that's a really difficult thing for schools to consider, because imagine you've got 2,000 students, 500 staff, the network's down, but you can't really tell them just yet what's happened. So what do you say? So those sorts of things are definitely elements that we have to consider. And when you do this compliance reporting and you're meeting your obligations through reporting to these bodies and organisations, typically what will happen is then they'll do further RFIs or requests for information. So you'll have to be in a constant two-way communication. They need the information that they need, and you need to be able to supply that in a timely fashion. So that's really, really important. But then once your reporting obligations are complete, you then move into recovery.
And when we talk about work intensification for principals, this is a prime example, because you're managing this. This is a 24-hour a day, maybe even 7 days a week, depending on how long this lasts for. But you're also running a school, business as usual, students needing to learn, teachers wanting to work. The show goes on.
Show goes on. And yet you got this ticking along in the background. So it can be quite a experience for principals to work through. But I think the tip here is to make sure that you're not working through it alone. You've got your critical incident response team. You're constantly communicating with the chair of the board. You've got your other external experts involved as required, and you're working through this with a team as appropriate. So you've completed all your formal reporting obligations. You've notified the relevant agencies and authorities and organisations. You've committed the notifiable data breach scheme. You've connected with perhaps the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner. There are a lot of layers there in terms of your reporting obligations. Then probably what's happening concurrently at this period of time is the negotiation with the threat actors. So as we've said, let's say with our data backups are all in place and the stance of the board is that we will not pay ransom. We believe we can back up and restore our systems straight away, minimal loss to business continuity. We do that, happy days, we're back online, knowing that potentially any data that's been compromised from our systems could then be leaked onto the darknet and be accessible for other malicious threat actors to purchase and use as they see fit. Now, obviously, then that becomes a PR exercise. So you're dealing with the reputational management of your school. Potentially, you're dealing with broken trust from your different stakeholders in terms of how could this possibly happen with my data? And we've seen this play out in the media. But that's one path. The other path is, let's say that for whatever reason, you have to pay the ransom. So you pay the ransom. That's being negotiated through with an external expert. And as we've said, that could be millions of dollars, could be 500,000, depends on the nature and level of your organization. So let's say you pay the ransom. That's coming out of your pocket, right? So if you've got great insurance as a school, paying of ransom could be potentially partly covered by your insurance, but it might not be. There's no guarantees. So for any principals or aspiring principals, know what your insurance policy covers. But let's say you pay that ransom, it comes out of your pocket. Then you've got all the costs associated with all the external experts that you've engaged. Millions. If you're not insured and you're covering the whole cost.
Huge impact to bottom line.
Huge impact. But let's say, for the sake of kicking this conversation along a little bit, Teagan, that you pay your ransom, the threat actors give you the keys, you decrypt the system, you unlock your data.
Which takes time.
Takes time.
So it doesn't, you're not just back online as soon as you get the key.
You're not back online. It could take days, depending upon the complexity and the size and the scale of your network. And you might see a rolling schedule of systems coming online, but it could take days or weeks. Then let's say everything's working great. You've followed everything you needed to do. Let's say that there was no data exfiltration. So even though threat actors gained access to your system and they locked you out and you paid the ransom, they didn't steal any of your data.
But do we know that?
We don't know that.
We think they haven't stolen it.
We think. We've got to take our advice from the experts in that case who are doing the forensic analysis. What are we communicating at that point? We're back. We're fully operational. And that's the recovery piece. But then from there are lots of other steps that we need to consider.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about systems back online. We're back to normal function. No threats remain. What does that recovery look like in your mind?
So once your systems come back online, people reporting that everything's working as it should be, people have access to everything that they need. Then it looks at not just the recovery, but the further risk mitigations that you need to put in place. So if budget allows, and you don't already have this in place as a school, schools should consider from this point on engaging a leading cybersecurity firm and potentially a managed security provider. A lot of the talk at the moment are around outsourcing this expertise because schools don't have it. So actually engaging someone like CrowdStrike or Carbon Black, which operate as what's known as an MDR, which stands for Manage, Detect, Respond. So essentially you're outsourcing your cybersecurity to someone who knows what they're doing, and that can provide you with an added layer of security and some greater assurances in terms of your network security moving forward. You need to straight away be engaging someone who can do some penetration testing on your network. So what we mean by that is a hacker who's actually looking for exploits and vulnerabilities in your network to identify where the gaps and the holes are so that they can produce a report for you and then you can go ahead and address those. And that absolutely needs to be part of this recovery. And then further to that, I think if schools don't already have something in place, they should be looking at national or international cybersecurity frameworks, which actually provides some guidance for schools in terms of the types of best practices schools should be operating within to make sure that their systems are as safe and secure as possible. There's one called NIST. It's not the only one. There's probably 5 or 6 gold standard frameworks that schools could adopt, but they're absolutely things that schools should be doing. And then after you do your recovery, you've gone ahead, you've mitigated risks, you've plugged the security holes in your network. Really then it becomes about evaluation of your response to the incident and then developing a plan of where to from here.
That reporting that we were provided when we started going through this work, It generated really rich and robust discussions, particularly around priorities. We've talked about finances and about budget and how expensive this type of work is. And it was really interesting to be part of those conversations, understanding, particularly with certain weaknesses or certain vulnerabilities, well, where will we prioritise our efforts and why? And how will we develop our posture over 3, 5, 7, 10 years? So it's not going from 0 to 100 in the first year, but how we continue to build and mobilise and build off that report that they provide is really central.
That's really important, Teagan, because you could spend $10 million tomorrow and your system still wouldn't be completely secure. So it is about budget, it's about context, and it's about risk appetite. So let's say that you've gone ahead and had some penetration testing completed, and let's say that there was 50 recommendations coming from that report. Well, it's about having a team go through those recommendations and assigning a risk profile to each one based on data, based on reputation, based on budget, and based on operational capacity and capability to be able to implement those recommendations. So you might actually come to a position where out of those 50 recommendations, you might be able to action 35 of them. You might be able to say, we've got 10 on our roadmap to do over the next 24 months, but 5 are actually considered acceptable risks for whatever reason. So that's a very reasonable and pragmatic response to a cybersecurity incident of this nature. What did you do? How did you do it? Were we prepared as possible? Were we happy with our response? Could we have done anything different? And then what do we need to do as a school to follow up from there? There is so much that you could review and debrief and debate, but it's really important to close the loop and have that discussion. And in fact, if you're a principal and you've just gone through an incident like this, you would be required to actually produce something like that for the board, including a roadmap on the way forward.
And as part of that ongoing prevention and keeping your middle and senior leaders part of those conversations as much as you can, bringing them along that journey in terms of the digital strategy and the deliverables that sit as part of that with this work so that they understand the severity and the nature and why we're talking about cybersecurity. The why that sits behind it has been really transformational for us as part of this work. So where do you see schools, principals, executive teams going from here? What do you think are the key takeaways from today's episode?
Listen, I think the key takeaway for me is to ask lots of questions. You don't have to be an expert in this space, but you have to know enough to be able to ask the right questions and don't assume anything. It's really easy for a principal or a senior leadership team to assume that our data is being backed up as per industry best practice, that we have the required cybersecurity protocols in place for when something happens. It's easy to assume, but you can't assume. And it's really difficult when you're managing all the different competing priorities in a school. This is just one more that you have to worry about. But it's a really critical and important part of the role of leading a school. Whether it's a smaller school, whether it's a large school, cybersecurity is almost one of the top 3 risks in the country right now, if not in the world. So questions that I'd be asking to you, if I was to leave our listeners with some specific questions, include things like, do you know where your data is stored? Do you know how it is backed up and how often? Do you know what your updating and patching schedule looks like for your network? When was the last time you conducted penetration testing? Do you know what your vulnerabilities are? And are you happy with those based on assigning a risk profile to each one? Do you have a manage, detect, respond cybersecurity platform in place protecting you and your network? And if not, is it something you can consider? Is it something that could be budgeted for? And then policies, protocols, and procedures. Starting at the top with the board. Does the board have a stance on payment of ransom? Many boards in schools that I know probably don't have a lot of expertise in cybersecurity, but increasingly over the next 5 to 10 years, I think you're going to see as part of a board's skills matrix that it's going to be essential for some expertise to exist on the board in that area. Know your insurance policy. Really dry. 100 pages probably, if not more. But what does your insurance actually cover? You don't have to know it all, but you need to know what questions to ask. So if your director of business is responsible for the school's insurance policy in their role as director of business, but also as company secretary, ask them the question. What else?
Things like the business continuity plan. Do you have one?
Right. And is there a scenario in that around cybersecurity? And what would your response be? And are you doing some desktop simulations with your senior management team, your executive team, so that you're feeling as prepared as you can be in the eventuation that something actually happens? Data is the big one. Data's the big one. So know your data. Why do you store that level of information? Do you need to do a data cleanse? What is the integrity of your existing data? What's the hygiene of the data? Is it accurate? Are we storing things that we shouldn't be storing anymore? What is the current legislation around data and privacy? Are we adhering to that? There's a lot of different factors related to data in schools, in organisations, but it's really, really important. And then professional learning is probably a piece that we haven't really touched on, Teagan. It's absolutely vital that we're building in some sort of cyber awareness training for our staff. We have the full spectrum of people in terms of their understanding and capabilities in relation to IT, data, cybersecurity. What are you doing for staff to raise their level of awareness? And what are you doing so that it's meaningful, it's actionable, but also is not too onerous is probably something that we need to consider.
And giving the message of why it's important, rather than why am I completing this 2-minute module with some multiple choice questions that I need to answer at the end every couple of months, or why am I receiving phishing emails, as an example, to catch me out. But those regular opportunities for training must be connected to that why. I think I'd add to reflecting on the questions that you need to ask yourself is, who has access to your data? How often do they have access to it, and how do they have access to it? And how you, as a senior leader in a school, get into the detail that you need to be in. So in our IT team, as an example, that's something that we delved into. 6 months before we started this work, I never would have thought to think about, how do the IT team access our data? What are the control mechanisms and authentication mechanisms in-house? Is it as secure as it needs to be? How easy is it for them to gain access to that? So those types of questions too, I think from a practical perspective for me, really stood out. You've talked about a lot of different tools, principles, networks, frameworks that people can go to. I think it'd be great if we can just summarise where people can go if they want more information.
Oh, there's so many places, Teagan. I would start with the Australian Institute of Company Directors. They've done a lot of work in the governance area around cybersecurity, best practices for boards, best practices for directors. They've even got some guidelines and frameworks that people can basically pull off the shelf and look at implementing in their own schools and organisations. That'd be a great place to start.
And we went to the conference last year. They have an annual conference based around cybersecurity, which was fantastic.
Yeah, it's really important. I think the Australian Cybersecurity Commission has a great cybersecurity assessment tool that schools and organisations can pick up. Once again, it's an off-the-shelf product. It can give you an assessment in terms of your maturity levels as a school or an organisation, and give you some pathways forward that you can use and adapt to your own context. As I said throughout the episode, I think adopt a framework. NIST is one that I would look at. It's readily available on the web. Just type in NIST Cybersecurity Framework and our listeners will be able to access that. And then it's about being open with your networks. For principals in particular, through forums like his meetings, conferences, networks, workshops, talking with other people, because people are going through the same thing that potentially you will be going through at some point in leading schools. So it's really important to share experiences, to learn from others, and to just keep a really open mind. But then just coming back to your own context and asking the questions that need to be asked. And it's okay not to know the details. You don't have to have done an undergraduate degree in computer science or anything like that, but it's about asking the right questions.
Some would say it's not a natural area of expertise for current modern day principals, but it certainly is for you. Can you talk us through why it's become a passion area for you?
I've been involved with technology, Teagan, since a young boy, and it's something that it's always been an interest area for me. I really immersed myself in a Bachelor of Applied Science and Computing and had a real focus on mathematics and an area of code breaking called cryptography. And so I've always had an interest right through to the current day as principal. And I'm always looking at what's happening, what's on the horizon, and immersing myself in that area. I know it's not common for a principal to come from that background, but it's not uncommon either.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your knowledge with us today. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too. Thanks, Teagan. That's a wrap on today's episode of The Principal's Perspective.
You can find us on LinkedIn. Just search for Dr. Adrian Camm and Teagan Collins and let us know your thoughts, questions, or leadership wins.
Make sure to follow The Principal's Perspective on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if today's episode resonated with you, share it with someone in your network.
You can be sure to find any references, books, or resources we discussed today in the show notes. Please jump on into the comments and join the conversation.